Now for a game dealing with this structure where there's a white pawn on e4 against a black pawn on d6 after a double exchange on d4, this arises in a lot of positions, a lot of main lines from the Ruy-Lopez, but this game is interesting and slightly fresher in that Efimenko uses a pet line of his, which he's been experimenting with. So after the main line Ruy-Lopez, he plays with knight d7, knight bd2, takes, and now rather than this knight c6 move, which was very popular for quite a while, and still, as far as I know, is fully viable, Efimenko chooses this interesting waiting move with rook e8. So he's played this a few times, and yeah, certainly it's a move with some merit. Balogun continue with knight f1, bishop b7, and now knight e3, which was a novelty at the time of the game, but is very sensible. The idea, as Balogun explains, is that after d5, which had been played in one of Efimenko's previous games, the knight can come from a5 to c4 and then to e5 with very comfortable play. So the idea, or the threat behind knight e3, is white wants to play d5, after which the knight on a5 is going to be sidelined. Accordingly, Efimenko decided to take on d4, knight takes d4. Now we have the structure I wanted to talk about a little bit. So this white pawn on e4 against the black pawn on d6. In pure structural terms, you could say that black has a weakness on d6, that white has an outpost on d5, that black has 3 pawn islands. But just in my experience of games from this structure, it's relatively rare that white manages to simply exploit his structural advantage in a straightforward way. Often these positions become very sharp. Often the e4 pawn gets traded for the d6 pawn, and we end up in a position with a pawn free center, as happens in this game ultimately. And one of the things about black structure is that although from a formal point of view it does contain defects, it also really facilitates his pieces. So the rook on e8 and the bishop on b7 are both excellently placed. He has control of important dark squares which restrain the e-pawn, and in general just has a lot more activity than you would ordinarily expect in a closed Ruy-Lopez. So black played bishop f8, and now Balogun played knight g4, which he criticized after the game. He gave a couple of interesting variations. They're both kind of similar. One starts with bishop d2, the other starts with b3, but the idea is to, in both cases, to give up this e-pawn in order to get the bishop to the long diagonal. And certainly once this pawn is being captured, the strong bishop on b7 has been exchanged, the rook on the e-file suddenly stops having such a clear purpose, and white's compensation is quite threatening here with ideas of knight f5, for instance. So Balogun's line continues, knight c4, queen f3, rook e8, knight d5, rook c8, exchange on e8, and rook e1. The knight comes back to e5. Queen d1, f6, f4, this tactical attack on the d5 knight with queen f7, and then knight f5, which he assesses as leading to compensation for white. The lines after b3 on the 17th move are similar. So I think interesting analysis by Balogun, and also interesting that rather than simply seeking to passively or statically exploit his nominally better pawn structure, he's suggesting that the most dangerous ideas in fact involve giving up a pawn and playing for compensation. So after knight g4, black played rook c8, bishop d2, knight c4, bishop c3, and knight d5. And again, it's a position where the weakness of the d6 pawn is very much an academic concern. It's a pawn which isn't attacked at all, and which is defended 3 times, and one could much more easily foresee a situation where this pawn either moves to d5, or if white were to take on e5, that the pawn recaptures on e5, rather than a situation where white were able to attack the pawn on d6 in a serious way. After a4, b4, the game became a lot sharper. Knight takes b2, queen b1, knight c4, and now a5, which Balogun criticizes and suggests knight takes e5 is a better try when he gives a variation leading to a wide advantage after d takes e5, but he suggests that knight takes e5 is just equal, which again is an assessment I agree with, but is an assessment which is perhaps counterintuitive if you're seeing these types of positions for the first time, because even after the trade of one minor piece, black's position still retains a lot of dynamic potential, and his pieces are still extremely active, especially these pieces. The queen can quite possibly find a useful role. For instance, b6 is a threatening square. Coming to h4 would be threatening also. And black retains dynamic potential with d5. So all of this dynamism means that black really has very little to worry about in this position. Instead, Balogun played a5, but then after takes and h takes g4, in fact, black maybe obtains slightly the better chances. So like I say, Balogun gives some detailed analysis here, but I think white now has a static pawn weakness of his own, in that he has double pawns on the g-file, while the black position continues to have a lot of dynamic potential. So black played g6. This is a very frequent regrouping which you see in this structure, which is that because the e5 pawn has been traded, this bishop will be very well placed on the long diagonal. So black brings the bishop to g7, queen a2, bishop g7, rook a d1, and now queen g5. Balogun suggests that a logical finish to the game would arise after queen h4. Bishop b3 and rook takes e4. For instance, bishop c4, rook e1, bishop d4. Takes king g7, bishop d5, and now this nice tactical finish with rook e8. Or excuse me, after bishop takes d4. If white were first to take on d6, queen takes g4. and now bishop takes g7, excuse me, bishop d5, rook e8, and black forces perpetual. So that would have been a logical finish, and again, quite a dynamic tactical solution. Instead, queen g5 led to a position where black broke with d5, but oddly enough, liquidating his only static weakness took a lot of the potential out of his position. And after he takes e5, exchange on e1 and queen e2, Balogun notes that for the first time he has a slight advantage in this game, because suddenly black's pieces begin to look slightly exposed, in particular the bishop on d5, which can't retreat comfortably because the knight on c4 would hang. And after h5, knight f5, an excellent and thematic resource takes, rook takes, queen g4 and f3. White has temporarily sacrificed a pawn, but suddenly the piece activity becomes very threatening. This rook is well placed on d5, but can go to d7, where it's even better. The bishop is very strong on the a2 g8 diagonal, and even after the exchange of queens, which occurred here, black still has serious difficulties stabilizing his position. F4 and rook e8. Now, Balogun says that rook c6 would be a more tenacious defensive attempt. But after rook e8, bishop f2, the rook just had to go back because the knight can't move in view of the threat to the f7 pawn. And now rook d5, and clearly if white manages to take on f5, he has a serious static advantage, two bishops and all of those traditional advantages. Rook g5 check, which is a nice tactic, because if black moves away from losing the h5 pawn with check, then after rook c5 he loses tactically because of the weakness of the c4 knight. So instead king h7, but now Balogun was able to take this pawn and play simply with king g2. And after a few more moves, he managed to consolidate this extra pawn, and with the two bishops and the exposed black king, the position is quite hopeless for black, and he resigned here. So, I mean, a game of quite considerable complexity, as you would expect, between two players of this caliber, but one which I think provides a reasonable hint as to how to approach these positions where black takes twice on d4, which is that the static consideration, namely that the d6 pawn is some form of a static classical weakness, is probably slightly inaccurate thinking, because in fact these positions tend to give black a lot of dynamic play and dynamic potential in exchange for this pawn, or in exchange for this static weakness. And so the best approach by both players is to play very actively, very dynamically. We saw in the notes some possibilities of pawn sacrifices by white, and that's really the spirit which these positions tend to demand.